Yeah, you might disagree with which premise. Particularly if you have the public record, you can't disagree with the major premise.
The minor premise.
You might disagree with the minor premise. You might say, oh, come on. If you are going to say absolutely you have to vote in a primary in order to be a good citizen, how many people in this country vote in every last primary election? You know what the turnout rate in most state primaries is in midterm election? Not the midterm election, but the primary for the midterm election? It can be as low as like 7%, 8% for some of these. And you're going to say a person isn't a good citizen because of that? That's quite an accusation. Aha. Well, it's been made. Is it fair? Do you think it's fair to say this? No. But let's go back and let's erase in a primary. Now it's a little harder to decide, maybe. Or let's change the major premise to, my political opponent didn't vote in the last election, which happened to be a primary. But I'm not going to say that. So syllogisms can be manipulated. They are manipulated. You have to be on your toes about them. It's not strictly a form of symbolic logic. The conditions can get messy. Now, let's try something else. Let's take these three propositions. Anna, you'll be glad to know you don't have to erase them. Okay? Let's start with the third one, and let's imagine that as a major premise. Okay? My political opponent isn't a good citizen. If someone doesn't vote, then that person isn't a good citizen. Can you make a conclusion from that? No, why not?
Because there could be other reasons that you're not.
Yes, yes. So, right, you can't. You run this thing backward, and it doesn't work the same way. There could be other reasons. But what if you just said, my political opponent isn't a good citizen? Because if someone doesn't vote, then that person isn't a good citizen. And what impression does that leave on many in the audience?
If someone who's not a good citizen still vote?
Well, it might leave the impression that that person didn't vote. I know you say that isn't valid, and it isn't valid, but now I'll say something that's shocking. Have you ever noticed that it's possible to fool some of the people some of the time? Have you ever noticed that people are gullible? Does the name P.T. Barnum mean anything to you in American history? Does the phrase, a sucker is born every minute, ring any bells of memory? Yes. So you have to be extraordinarily careful. You really have to study certain claims, especially certain syllogistic claims. Now, one of the other forms of statement that we run across here in Corbett is necessary and sufficient. We've already covered that, and that's a very important one. We talked about it in the class before. Certain things are necessary to be true in order for something else to be true. In other words, they're sine qua nons, you have to have them. And if you don't have them, then you can't get a certain result. But it's also possible that they are not sufficient, meaning if they're true, it doesn't necessarily mean that that conclusion follows. Can anyone think of an example of something that is necessary but not sufficient?
So to be a bachelor, it is necessary to be a man, but being a man is not sufficient to like having the title of the bachelor?
Yeah, so we use the word bachelor as a gender-specific word. We have the word bachelorette, which is a derivative word for a woman. But yes, all right. So it has to do with whether it encompasses a whole class or not. There are many men who aren't bachelors. Mm-hmm. But you have to be a man in order to be called a bachelor, generally speaking.
Yeah.
Now, of course, with the advent of same-sex marriage, this may change even, and we may change terms that we use. But nevertheless, conventionally speaking, that would be the case. So necessary and sufficient It's important to keep in mind. I have read many papers, many editorials, much student work, much work of professional speech writers in which something which is necessary is put forward as being both necessary and sufficient. And say, no, that's not true. If-then statements. Corbett talks a little bit about these. They're important. I say, assuming I'm standing on Earth, if I drop a pen, then it falls. Is that true? Yeah, I don't want to get too, scholastic about this. Let's be straightforward. I'm not in a zero-gravity airplane. I'm not in an elevator. I'm standing on Earth. I'm holding a pen. It doesn't have a string attached to my finger. If I drop it, it falls. Okay? Fair enough. It's an if-then statement. It's an obvious one. Let me try this one out on you now. If a pen doesn't fall, then I haven't dropped it. Is that true? No? Are you sure? Why might you think it's not true? If a pen doesn't fall, if it hasn't fallen, then I haven't dropped it. This is tougher.
Well, it feels like it sort of depends what fall means. If fall means falls and hits the ground, then no, you could catch it, you could drop it and then catch it, right?
I mean descend through the air any distance. Fair enough? I don't mean necessarily hit the ground. If a pen does not descend at all in elevation, in any way, is it true then that I haven't dropped it? I would say it is true. Yes. This is what is called the contrapositive of a statement. You reverse the if-then terms and you negate them. And if the original positive statement is true, the contrapositive is true. Well, let's take another case. If a pen falls, then I've dropped it. Is that true? Not necessarily. Could it be true? Yes. If I haven't dropped a pen, then that pen won't fall. Is that true? No. Those are the converse and the inverse statements. Might they be true? Yeah, maybe. So, have I got your head swimming a little now with some of this verbal logic? Good. You need to go back to Corbett and do some of the exercises in Corbett. They ask you to do exercises about finding out whether syllogisms are true and whether they're valid. Now, very occasionally, you'll be puzzled and you'll say, well, that's equivocal. We can't really decide. Look for keywords like every, none, all. And in your writing, think about those words as well. Every, none, all. Because there's a difference between universal propositions and propositions that are particular or maybe only about a subgroup of a certain class. And really clear writing generally demands that you make a distinction between those two and tell your reader whether you are making a universal claim or whether you are making a particular claim about an individual or about a subgroup within a larger body. It's very helpful. It's very helpful to do this. On page 39 of Corbett, there is something called the square of opposition, which if you take even just a 5-minute look at, I think will become clear to you. It is about universal and particular affirmatives and negatives. So if you take a look at that, you will see that the way Corbett has done this is to say, on the upper left, all men are mortal beings. Well, we can assume that's true. Let's call it true. The contrary would be the universal negative. No men are mortal beings. But then there's also a particular affirmative, some men are mortal beings. That's certainly true, but it's a rather weak statement. You're going to say some men are mortal beings? Well, yes. If all men are mortal beings, why don't you say that? And then there's a particular negative. Some men are not mortal beings. Well, if the universal negative is not true, then the particular negative is not true. Now, this may sound simple, but once you get into language, in speeches and in writing, it gets a little more complicated. It gets like that example about voting in a primary. It can be a little hard to decide exactly. You have to be careful. Do you ever come away from a speech or a piece of writing and say, but she didn't tell us ... We don't know if ... And sometimes the person who gave that speech or wrote that composition didn't want you to ask that question. They actually wanted you to come to a conclusion without asking that question. Do you ever listen to a speech of some kind and have that reaction? But we don't know if? And I would suggest to you, and this goes to the ethical treatment of rhetoric, I'd suggest to you that using enthymemes and syllogisms to convince your reader of something that you know might not be valid or that you know might not be true is really a little shifty. I don't recommend it. It can be done. It's done a lot in politics. It's done with innuendo. It's done with enthymemes. It's done in debate. But I would suggest that before you commit that act, you really examine your own rhetorical soul and ask if you want to do that. Because what you are doing, in essence, is a form of insincerity. You are being the word that is commonly applied to much of our public discourse today, alas, too often accurately. You are being cynical. You are expecting your audience to swallow something that you have handed them. Now, for next time, for next class, I'd like to begin by looking at Patrick Henry's speech to the Virginia delegates. This is not the one a little later in the syllabus, which is about ratification of the federal Constitution. This is the famous speech that begins, "But as for me, give me liberty or give me death." Interestingly enough, we have no actual manuscript or shorthand record of the speech. The record we have is from 1824, and he gave the speech in 1765. What is that? That's 35 and 24. That's 59 years later. Can you trust it, therefore, as the true words of Patrick Henry? Well, probably not. Did he give a speech like this? Yes, we all know that that's the case. So it is a matter of historical record, perhaps inaccurate, but it is a really famous address. And what I would like to do on Thursday, because he give you plenty of time to study it, is to look at how Henry uses logos, pathos, and ethos in this address. And can you construct a syllogism out of this address? Maybe not a very short, very neat one, but a slightly messy, therefore pertinent one. I'd like you to begin also by looking at a document that should be familiar to many of you, the Declaration of Independence. And I would like you to read that through and see if you can find in it syllogistic reasoning. Okay? If you can determine whether in some form that magnificent document is drawn up with a sense of someone having studied syllogisms.